Hello, in this video we will be discussing about the 12 houses. In our last video we discussed about the 12 zodiac signs. So this is not to be confused with the zodiac signs. We will be discussing about 12 houses in this video. The houses would be 1 through 12, and each house would represent a different area of our life. And the houses, again, I'm repeating myself, is not to be confused with the zodiac signs. In our last video we discussed about the 12 zodiac signs starting from Aries through Pisces, 1 through 12. And in this video we will be discussing about the 12 houses starting from 1 through 12. And once again, as in our last video, we are going to be discussing the houses as explained by the great sage Parashara. And Parashara, as I have explained in my last video, has been considered a father of Vedic astrology, and was there a few thousand years ago, and he is considered to be, his text and his knowledge is still very relevant and considered to be an authority even by the modern day astrologers. And as we go along and as we read the charts, the Vedic charts of individuals in our coming videos, you will see that Parashara principles or sage Parashara principles make a lot of sense. So we are going to be discussing about the 12 houses as per what sage Parashara has mentioned. The sage Parashara mentions about the first house, that the first house where you see number 1 on the screen, that is actually the first house or the ascendant, and that is actually considered the ascending zodiac sign or the ascending Rashi. And the ascendant basically is nothing but when a person is born, the sign which was rising on the eastern horizon becomes his ascendant or his ascending Rashi. And that sign keeps changing every 24 hours because every 2 hours it changes, and every 2 hours the ascendant completely changes and it moves to the next zodiac sign. But as of now we are not getting into what zodiac signs we are talking about. We'll just talk about the significations of the various houses regardless of what zodiac sign it would be. So the first house, like I mentioned, by Maharishi Parashara or the sage Parashara, describes one's physique, his body, his total appearance, his intellect in terms of the complete personality and how it relates to his intellect, pretty much his complete self, the complexion of the body, whether he's fair or dark, his body vigor, strength or weakness, happiness in general. What does he look like when you meet a person? How does he look like? Does he look happy? Does he look sad or in grief? So pretty much the entire nature of a person is to be assessed through the ascending Rashi or the ascendant as it's called, or the first house. So the first house is nothing but the ascendant or the ascending Rashi. And like I just mentioned, we are not going to discuss the first house in respect to the Rashi or the zodiac sign, which we discussed in our last video. We'll just talk about the signification of the first house as per what the sage Parashara has mentioned. Now sage Parashara has described the second house as follows: he describes the second house represents, and the second Vedic house in somebody's chart represent wealth. So you can determine, when you look at a chart, you can determine his wealth based on the second house. Grains. Now, grains was relevant in the earlier times because Sage Parashara was there thousands of years ago. So obviously his wealth could be related to grains as well, because at that time food was very important. People with grains and their houses full of grains would be considered wealthy in terms of being able to provide for their family. So he's related that grains to wealth. So he talks about wealth, grains, the family. So the entire family of that individual also is indicated by the second house. And metals, precious stones also are to be understood through the second house. What kind of precious metals he has, what kinds of stones he has, what kind of jewelry he has. So everything pretty much relates to family and wealth as far as Parashara is concerned for the second house. Now, the signification of the third house as described by Parashara is pretty much valor. What is your valor? I mean, how strong are you in terms of converting your desires into reality? I mean, are you there to go out and take the required risk and move ahead in life? So the third house represents that. And we are, again, I'm mentioning again that we are not getting into the zodiac. That zodiac and the planets associated with the third house is going to determine, and then we can do a complete reading. But as of now, we are just talking about the third house as what it signifies. So it does signify valor and brothers and sisters as well. And more so on the younger brothers and sisters. The third house is representative mostly for younger brothers or sisters. But in general, Parashara did mention that it signifies brothers and sisters, and you can determine your brothers and sisters, your relationship with them, so on and so forth through the third house. The fourth house is representative of conveyances, like the cars you drive, the conveyances you use, your mother, your happiness, because it's also called Sukh Bhava, which means happiness, a bhava of happiness. Treasure, huge treasure. We're not talking about the wealth we just discussed about the second house, but treasures. In those days, in the olden times, people did, come across some treasures. They could lay their hands on some treasures, and that is indicative, or that's indicated by the fourth house. Another signification of the fourth house is lands and buildings. That means real estate, property. That has to be determined through the fourth house. So in today's times, relevant times, if you want to determine an aspect which is concerned with real estate and property, we'll first look at a chart and look at the fourth house. Now, Sage Parashara has described the fifth house, which is representative of sacred spells, and in modern day terms we can just say that it means mantras, learning, knowledge, and the real intellect. That's what the fifth house is all about. Children, and in specific terms, sons, because in the ancient times children was more closely associated with sons, because in the olden times people used to think that sons are very important because they will carry on with this, they will take the family name ahead. Of course, these things do not make any relevance in today's lifestyle and society. Sons and daughters are considered to be equally important, and and also considered precious by the parents. So the fifth house does represent children, and also mantras, amulets. So Sage Parashara has also mentioned amulets, which is related to the fifth house. And I think amulets is mentioned here because amulets again are associated with some kind of sacred spell which is infused into it, or a protective amulet which may contain some diagrams or something like a yantra. So that's also indicative of the fifth house. So a protective amulet, or an amulet for a specific purpose, or an amulet with a yantra, that also is associated with the fifth house as per Sage Parashara. The sixth house, explained by Sage Parashara, definitely talks about the maternal uncle, your uncle from your mother's side. So it could be your brother of your mother, and that is represented by the sixth house as per Sage Parashara. And many modern day astrologers do agree with this, because based on the research done by them, they do agree that a maternal uncle is definitely associated with the sixth house. Enemies is another area of one's life which is indicated of the sixth house. Stepmother also has been described by Sage Parashara as associated with the sixth house. Diseases, which Sage Parashara may not have mentioned, but there are several other astrologers who have also associated diseases with the sixth house. So the general health and personality and the physique is associated with the ascendant or the first house. However, diseases is associated with the sixth house. So there's a slight difference here. Now Sage Parashara goes ahead and talks about the seventh house. He talks about the seventh house as the house of relationships and a house of your wife. So you can look at a chart and determine, in a man's chart, the seventh house would be representative of the wife, and in a female's chart, the seventh house would be representative of the husband, or any kind of a relationship, not necessarily a marital relationship, but even other relationships can be determined by the seventh house. The eighth house, as explained by Sage Parashara, is a house of longevity. It is also a house of your inheritances, and also through the eighth house you can figure out your past life karma in your past birth. So Sage Parashara actually has gone a step further, and he has said that the eighth house will be a house of mystery that will also explain about things that have happened in the past, and also which are going to happen in the future births. So as per the scripture of Sage Parashara, I think we can determine that yes, a lot of things have been predestined for us based on our past lives karma. So it's not just one life. We could have several past lives where our karma has accumulated, and the eighth house is representative of things that are going to happen in the future births as well, and also what has happened in the past, in the past few births as well. So that makes it a very important house of a Vedic chart, because it opens up things that have happened in the past and the future. And of course, the second thing, which is the most important thing related to this house, is it indicates longevity. So how much a person is going to live, that of course can be determined by the eighth house. And then of course the eighth house, what zodiac it is representative of, what planets are sitting in it, where the lord of the eighth house will be sitting in the entire chart, which house does he go and sit in, which zodiac he sits in, what strength does he carry, and we're going to get into those details as we go along. However, as of now, we just know that the eighth house is representative of these things. The ninth house has been described by sage Parashara as explaining one's fortunes or luck. So it is also called a bhagyasthana. Bhagyasthana means luck. So you can determine an individual's luck through the ninth house. And once again, I'm repeating myself, it depends on what zodiac it is in a person's chart. The ninth house is what zodiac, what is the lord of the ninth house, where the lord is sitting, what strength is the lord sitting with, what is the degree of that planet which is the lord of the ninth house, what aspects it's receiving, whether it's exalted or debilitated. I mean, these are all things which, again, I'm repeating myself, that we will go along in our future videos. But as of now, let's understand that the indication of the ninth house is that it is related to our fortunes and luck. Also, sage Parashara has said that the wife's brother also can be determined by the ninth house. That's very interesting. So a lot can be determined from your ninth house, which relates to your wife's brother, or in a woman's chart it will relates to the brother of the husband. Another area which is represented by the ninth house is religion. And another area, as per sage Parashara, which is indicative of the ninth house, is brother's wife. And also visits to religious places is also represented or can be understood by the ninth house. And again, we are talking about the houses right now. We are not getting into the zodiac signs, because we've discussed the zodiac signs in our previous video, and now we are just talking about those houses. And then later on in our future videos, we are going to relate those houses with the zodiac signs. So sage Parashara has also described the ninth house as an indication whether a person will be visiting shrines, what kind of shrines he'll be visiting, what kind of religious places he'll be going to, so on and so forth. That's one of the other indications of the ninth house. Moving on to the 10th house. The 10th house, as per Parashara, indicates authority. So based on the 10th house, you can figure out what kind of an authority that person will have. I mean, you will see in the charts of kings and big ministers and people with authority, the 10th house will speak for itself. And of course, once again, it'll depend on the 10th house, the zodiac, the planets which are occupying it, the strength of those planets, whether they're exalted, debilitated, so on and so forth. But as an indication, what the 10th house represents, it represents authority and also royalty. I mean, there are no kings in the present day and age, so I mean, royalty doesn't make sense, but yes, authority. And there are people in places of authority, like there are no kings these days, but they are ministers. There are people who are occupying high positions of authority. Also, the 10th house, as per sage Parashara, explains about the profession one will take, his livelihood, the honor which he will gain in his life. And sage Parashara says that father is also the indication or the representation of the 10th house. And there is a slight disagreement here. Some astrologers and some other texts have described the ninth house as the father's house, not the 10th house as is being described by sage Parashara. And in the south, people from South India, or the pundits or the astrologers from South India, they consider more the father as a representation of the ninth house rather than the 10th house. However, Parashara talks about the 10th house, which is an indication of father. And if you look at it, since the fourth house represents mother and the house opposite to it becomes the father, because then it's the seventh from the fourth, it makes a lot of sense here by Parashara that since the mother is the fourth house, the 10th house would be the father. But anyways, we'll just leave it at that there is a slight disagreement there based on other texts and the experiences of the astrologers. The astrologers in South India talk about the indication of the ninth house as an indication of the father, not the 10th house, as explained by sage Parashara. Indications of the 11th house would be the son's wife, so it'll be the daughter-in-law, and most importantly, the income. It's also called the Ayabhava. Ayabhava means Aya means income. So what will be one's sources of income? That can be determined by the 11th house. So the 11th house is representative of the income of the person. Sage Parashara has gone extent to also say that prosperity also are to be explained by the 11th house. And then 11th house, when you talk of prosperity, it is concerned or it's related with wealth, and the house of wealth is the second house. So if you kind of see that, and we'll discuss in our future videos, that if there is a relationship between an 11th house and the second house, and the second house being a house of wealth and the 11th house being a house of income and prosperity, and if they are related, it becomes a major Raj Yoga, a great yoga to be wealthy. But yes, we will discuss about, and we'll get into case studies also with this kind of a combination. So 11th house related to money, income, prosperity. Second house again, which we've already discussed, is related to wealth. And lastly, talking about the 12th house, one knows about expenses. It's a Vyaya Bhava. Vyaya means expenses. So the 12th house, you can know about expenses, and sage Parashara is extremely clear about it, and based on the experiences of modern day astrologers, it makes a lot of sense, because when they determine the 12th house and study the 12th house for expenses, their predictions come to be correct, which explains how true sage Parashara was. It also talks about moksha, which is salvation. Bhrigu is very clear about that. Another sage, Bhrigu, who was also a father of Vedic astrology, has mentioned that 12th house is very closely associated with salvation or moksha. So Parashara has not explained too much about that part for the 12th house. He has just talked about expenses, and also he has mentioned about one's own death, which many modern astrologers may not agree. Most modern astrologers have come to a conclusion that from the 12th house we can know about expenses and also about salvation or moksha, as mentioned by the great sage Bhrigu. So that ends our discussion on the 12 houses. Friends, this is 12 houses again, not the 12 zodiac signs. And in our next video, we will discuss about another topic.